Hey guys, here I'll be taking a look at the new polls that were just released in the last 2 days. So on the Senate level, we saw two new polls from both North Carolina and Georgia, as well as a lot of old polls released for many races in solid GOP states like Florida, South Dakota, South Carolina, Iowa, and Alaska. These polls are pretty old and don't really tell us too much about these races at this point in time, but we do have these two in North Carolina and Georgia polls, both showing Democrats head. This is the second time in a row that Sherry Beasley is leading over Ted Budd, so it may be that Democrats finally flip North Carolina on the Senate level for the first time since 2008. We also saw two new polls, one from Florida as well as one from Utah, showing some pretty concerning numbers for the GOP candidates in these races as well. And of course, on the gubernatorial level, we saw one new poll from Georgia and another one from Florida. And so starting off by looking at the North Carolina poll, Sherry Beasley leads by a margin of 4%, and this is very reflective of the national environment nationwide. Democrats, of course, have now taken the lead in terms of the generic ballot against Republicans nationwide, and this really should not be happening in a red wave year as 2022 is supposed to be. Democrats should be way behind in this metric. Of course, they're doing much worse than they were in both 2018 and 2020, but it really is a very positive note for Democrats that they're actually even leading in the generic ballot nationwide, despite Joe Biden having an approval rating of negative 16% nationwide. So what we're seeing here is that yes, Joe Biden is not helping Democrats, but his approval rating is not having as big of an effect on these races that Republicans would hope. And so if you look at all the most recent polling done for the generic ballot, I mean, a lot of these polls are released every single day, and basically every single one of them so far has shown Democrats leading in the last couple of days. And if we look at the 5:30 forecast, Democrats now have a 60% chance at winning the Senate for the first time ever. It is now 6-10 that Democrats win control of the upper chamber for a second time. 5:30 now projects Democratic wins in Georgia as well as Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada. So actually looking at this forecast, Democrats are expected to gain a seat after the elections this November. And so coming back to the North Carolina poll, for the second time in a row, Sherry Beasley leads over Ted Budd. Budd has basically not led in a single poll since all the way back at the very beginning of July. And if you look at the polling average here, Ted Budd's margin has gone down to now just 0.3% against Beasley. Of course, Ted Budd is the GOP nominee chosen to succeed Richard Burr. Sherry Beasley is the Democratic nominee in this race, and for a long time, people really counted her out. But at this point, these numbers are very encouraging for her campaign, and they really do show that she does stand a chance in this race, even though North Carolina at this point in time is still probably going to go to the Republican Party. The last time the Democrats won a statewide election in North Carolina on the Senate level or even on the presidential level as well was all the way back in 2008, where Kay Hagan defeated Elizabeth Dole by 8.5%. Now, 2008 was basically the biggest blue wave year we've seen in decades. Of course, it coincided with the election of Barack Obama after 8 years of George W. Bush, who was the most unpopular president in American history. So if you look at the 2008 elections, I mean, 59 seats for Democrats. It was not surprising at all that they won North Carolina. I mean, they even won in Louisiana as well as Alaska. So we're never going to see something like this again in a very long time because of just how polarized politics has become. So North Carolina flipping in 2008 was not that big of a surprise, but if it happened this year, it would be a really big win for Democrats. And so that is why it probably is not going to happen. If you look at the 5:30 forecast, they currently classify North Carolina as a lean Republican state. Sherry Beasley is still very competitive. She has a 35% chance at winning, but at this point it's pretty comparable to even Ohio. And of course, we all know that J.D. Vance is probably still going to win that race, no matter how well Tim Ryan does for a Democrat. And so looking at our map, of course, North Carolina is going to be one of those major races. I still have it as a lean Republican state. I don't think Democrats are going to be able to flip this one this year. I think that in the coming years, Democrats have a very good chance at winning. But I mean, just look at the polls for the 2020 race between Cal Cunningham and Tom Tillis. In 2020, these were the polling numbers for the Democrats. They led in every single poll. And of course, this was after Cal Cunningham had a scandal. He had a sexting scandal that led his wife to leave him during the campaign. And so that definitely made a big dent in his chances, and I do believe that if Cal Cunningham did not have that scandal very late in the race, he would have won his seat, and Democrats would currently hold 51 seats in the U.S. Senate. And so if you look at the final results in 2020, Cal Cunningham lost by 1.7%. He, in fact, did even worse than Joe Biden. So the polls are not accurate in North Carolina, and they do almost always overestimate Democrats. And yes, Democrats have won races here recently. Of course, Roe Cooper was elected just a couple of years ago, but on the Senate level, Democrats Democrats have not had that many wins in the last couple of decades, and so 2022 really is not going to be the year in which that changes. And, we saw just with Cal Cunningham how well Democrats can be doing, but still lose. Cal Cunningham's race at that point in time, he raised the most amount of money for any campaign in American history for a Senate race, and that was not even enough to help him cross the finish line. And now moving on to the Georgia race, we got a new poll between Warnock and Walker. This poll puts Raphael Warnock up by a margin of 3%. Even though it's funded by a Democratic sponsor, it is still very significant and similar to the other results that we've seen over the last couple of months. Looking at the polls in Georgia, Democrats have been doing very well here with Raphael Warnock as their candidate. Basically, Warnock has led throughout the entirety of the summer, and Herschel Walker was expected to win this race, and by a pretty big margin for a very long time. If you look at many of the earlier polls, Herschel Walker was destroying Raphael Warnock. I mean, it really looked like Walker was going to become the next senator from Georgia, but now it seems as if Walker has retaken the lead, and a polling average lead of 2.7% in Georgia is very significant. This is larger than Biden's average against Donald Trump in 2020, and of course, if you look at the two races in 2021 between Raphael Warnock and Kelly Loeffler, as well as Jon Ossoff and David Perdue, the polls were basically spot on in predicting the 2021 elections. Of course, in the end, Warnock won by 2.1% and Ossoff by 1.2%. So the races in 2020, they were basically predicted perfectly by the polls. If you looked at the 530 average for both of these races, they were spot on. They were also spot on the presidential level and have been for many years now in Georgia. So the pollsters in Georgia are doing something right. It's not anything like the polls that we're seeing in North Carolina. And so that's why this 2.7% margin really is very significant for Raphael Warnock. And if we look at his approval rating right now, Warnock has a +5 net approval in a state that favors Republicans by 7 points. So it's pretty good for Warnock. Warnock is positively approved of in his state, while Joe Biden is basically in the 30s. So he definitely is defying the odds considering how unpopular the president is. And if you look at the 530 forecast, it's 50-50 for both Democrats and Republicans. Many of these scenarios show Walker or Warnock winning in a runoff, which I think is still very possible. That's what happened in both Georgia races 2 years ago. And if you look at how this forecast has changed, I mean, this race, 62%, it was going to go to Republicans at the start of this forecast when it started being tracked. But if you look at the race now, it's basically 50-50, and Democrats are actually expected to win the first round vote, and basically every single poll puts Warnock ahead. So, I mean, this race has gone through a significant shift over the last couple of months, and so that is why Georgia right now I have as a lean Democratic state. I think Georgia will be as blue as North Carolina is red this November. Now, the interesting thing here is that Brian Kemp is actually leading by 4.9% in the gubernatorial election in the Peach State, while Herschel Walker is down by 2.7%. And so this really just goes to show you how much better Democrats are doing in the Senate race than in the governor election. And so this really should be worrying for Senate Republicans. And if you look at these polls, the most recent one does show a tie between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. But if you do look at most of them, this most recent poll is definitely an outlier. Every single poll has shown Brian Kemp leading over the last couple of months, and Stacey Abrams is not going to win this race. Brian Kemp barely won in 2018, that is true, but most governors do win their re-elections, and of course 2018 was a much better year for the Democratic Party as a whole. I think that Stacey Abrams will be able to win a major race in Georgia in the next couple of years, but I do not believe that 2022 is going to be her year. If you look at this race, it is much less competitive than the one 4 years ago. If you look at the polls for 2018, I mean, a lot of the polls even show tied races, and some even had Stacey Abrams ahead. We're completely not seeing that this year. Brian Kemp is leading by much larger margins, and of course, polls in Georgia have been known for being pretty accurate, so that's why this 4.9% lead is significant for Republicans, just like the 2.7% lead for Raphael Warnock on the Senate level is for Democrats. And so we're seeing two very different races here in Georgia. Warnock leading by 2.7. He's probably going to win this race, and we're going to see a lot of ticket splitting for Democrats in the Senate election, and of course for Republicans on the gubernatorial level. And so Brian Kemp is pretty likely to win his re-election. If you look at the governor forecast, according to 538, he has an 85% chance at victory, just 15 for Stacey Abrams. And I mean, the odds have not really changed over the last couple of months, even though Democrats are doing much better nationwide, as well as in the Senate election. Currently 530 projects around a 6.3% margin in favor of Brian Kemp. I think that is very, very reasonable. He's going to do much better than he did in 2018, and that's just simply because of the fact that he's running for re-election. Most governors, of course, win their second terms, and also the fact that the state of Georgia, after voting for Democrats 3 times in 2020, is probably not going to come out with the same enthusiasm as they did 2 years ago. Next up, we have the state of Florida to look at. Marco Rubio versus Val Demings. Rubio has led in basically most of the polls that have been done, basically all of them, except for this one poll in May, as well as the most recent one that actually shows an even race. But of course, Florida Watch and Progress Florida are both Democratic sponsors, so this poll was obviously going to skew in favor of Democrats. But what's surprising is that Marco Rubio is actually polling worse than Ron DeSantis. If you look at the two matchups between DeSantis and Crist, as well as DeSantis and Fried, DeSantis leads by 6 and 3%. Charlie Crist, though, is probably going to end up winning the Democratic nomination against Nikki Fried. Crist is the former governor that was elected as a Republican all the way back in 2006, but Ron DeSantis at this point is doing very well in his re-election. If we look at the last Senate election that we had in 2016, Marco Rubio won 52% of the vote, Patrick Murphy just 44%, and in 2018 we did see very competitive races in Florida, but I mean if you look at the generic ballot that year, it was heavily favoring the Democrats. Democrats are up on average nationwide by 8.6% in November of 2018, and Republicans were still able to win both Florida races. Rick Scott won by 0.1% against Bill Nelson, who is running for his 5th term in office. Democrats even won in West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana, but they could not win Florida for a 5th time with Nelson as the incumbent. And on the gubernatorial level, of course, Ron DeSantis was elected by 0.4% against Andrew Gillum. Gillum, I believe, has been recently charged with some sort of crime, so we're probably not going to see him in the political arena in Florida anytime soon. But Ron DeSantis is now on track for his re-election after his 2018 win. It was one of the most surprising ones that we had because every single poll basically suggested a Gillum win pretty narrowly, but of course Ron DeSantis is now one of the frontrunners for the 2024 GOP nomination. And so that combined with the fact that Donald Trump did better in 2020 in the Sunshine State than in 2016, we're very likely to see a DeSantis victory, as well as a victory for Marco Rubio on the Senate level, with Rubio defeating Val Demings. Val Demings really does not stand a chance in this race. I mean, just look at every single rating for the Florida Senate election. Every single source has it as a likely or lean Republican state. And if you look at the 538 forecast, of course, Marco Rubio has a 91% chance at defeating Val Demings, and the odds here really have not changed too much over the last couple of months. And if you look at the governor election, I mean, even higher chances for Ron DeSantis, 94, just 6 for Charlie Crist. So the elections in Florida are not nearly going to be as competitive as they were in the 2018 midterms, and so that's going to be very good news for the Republican incumbents running for re-election in those races. And finally, in Utah, Mike Lee only leads by a margin of 9.2%. I mean, it's surprising that we're even talking about this race in 2022. Of course, McMullen is the independent that ran in the 2016 presidential election. He came in 3rd place in Utah, and he made it so that Donald Trump did not even win a majority of votes in the state against Hillary Clinton. And so that just shows you how unpopular Donald Trump is in Utah. And so Mike Lee, as a Trump Republican, is facing a pretty tough challenge from McMullen. Most independents are going to go in favor of McMullen, as well as most Democrats. Of course, Democrats chose to endorse Evan McMullen instead of nominating their own candidate, because of course Democrats would have absolutely no chance in this race. In 2018, Mike Lee won his first election by 41%. So I mean, that just goes to show you the Democrats are not going to be competitive in this race at all. So a win for McMullen would be a win for Democrats, even though McMullen is a conservative. And if you look at the latest polls for this race, I mean, things are not going well for Lee. The most recent poll that was just released yesterday shows Mike Lee up by just 14%, and this poll was funded by his own campaign. If you look at the previous poll funded by his campaign, Lee was up by 19%. So we saw a 5-point shift away from Mike Lee in just the last couple of months, and Lee is not even at 50% in this most recent poll, even though his own campaign chose the respondents. And if you look at actually the most recent poll conducted, you'll see that Mike Lee was only up by a margin of 5%, according to a B-rated pollster. So these numbers should be pretty worrying for the Republican Party. They are going to have to put more money into this race because of how competitive Evan McMullen is, but in the end, independents typically perform worse than anything that polls may suggest. And if you look at the 530 forecast, I mean, it's a very solid Republican state. McMullen only has a 2% chance at winning, and despite McMullen only being down in the polls by 9%, they currently project a 20-point margin of victory for Mike Lee. I think the race is going to be slightly closer. I think that 15% would be a much better prediction, but still, it's going to go to Republicans nonetheless. And so these were the new polls that were just released in the last couple of days. We're seeing a very similar trend to what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks. I mean, positive numbers for the Democratic Party, despite 2022 being a supposedly red wave year. That probably is not going to be as strong of a wave as Republicans would like to hope, but Democrats are still in a pretty precarious situation in many gubernatorial elections, as well, of course, in many Senate elections, but the latest numbers should be very motivating for them, and we're just going to have to wait and see whether or not they can keep up this momentum. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below whether or not you think Democrats can actually win in Florida, or do you think Mike Leake will actually lose to Evan McMullin in the Utah race. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't. Consider getting a channel membership for just 99 cents per month, and I'll see you guys in the next video.